Welcome and thank you everyone for joining the panel on climate change adaptation. My name is Kem Lowry. I'm a retired professor from the University of Hawaii's Department of Planning and Urban and Regional Planning. With us on the panel are two very experienced climate change specialists. The first is Sam Lemmo, who established and administers the Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands within the Department of Land and Natural Resources. And he was involved in completing the Hawaii Sea Level Rise Vulnerability and Adaptation report that we will discuss in a little while. Also, a member of the panelists is Matt Gonser, who serves as the Coastal and Water Program Manager for the City and County of Honolulu's Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency.
My name is Sam Lemmo. I'm an administrator, or I'm the administrator at the Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands. It's basically an office in the Department of Land and Natural Resources, primarily responsible for regulation of all conservation lands in the state, but we also are involved in protecting the state's beaches and providing guidance on shoreline management and also sort of running the State Climate Commission. This report does a few major things. One, it identifies all of the areas around the state of Hawaii that are vulnerable to sea level rise throughout this century, and it provides sea level rise benchmarks of half a foot, 2 feet, and then 3.2 feet. Those might not be the exact numbers, but it's close enough for horseshoes. And so we wanted to be able to show that, and so we modeled the expanse of shoreline of sea level rise effects across the land. The second thing we did is we did a very good scientific evaluation of how sea level rise is affecting the islands, how the science works. One of the other things we did is we had a very strong section that discusses our methodologies. What type of methodologies did we use to demonstrate sea level rise inundation areas or illustrate sea level rise inundation areas across the state? And I'll get into all of that in more detail in the next few slides. And of course, finally, we talked about recommendations for adapting to sea level rise. And so now the heavy discussion is on what are we going to do going forward to reduce the impact of sea level rise on our island, on our economy, on our society. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. This is basically the foundation of the science and the modeling that we have published in the Sea Level Rise report. We're calling it a SLREXA. SLREXA stands for Sea Level Rise Exposure Area. No, it's not a prescription drug, although it sounds like it. You know, take one SLREXA and call me in the morning. I'm suffering from a headache and chronic sea level rise. So basically what this is we did something that nobody else has done in the country that I know of, is that we understood that sea level rise is not just a one-dimensional problem, meaning that most people illustrate sea level rise via a passive phenomenon, meaning they simply just create a computer model, and it's called a digital elevation model, and then basically they just raise the water up. That's called a bathtub model. Just raise it up, and then you'll see all of a sudden areas that are low-lying start to fill in with water. And so that's called a passive flooding from sea level rise. The problem we had with passive flooding is that it really doesn't show you the multifaceted effects of sea level rise, i.e. how it's going to change the nature of our coastline, the nature and shape of our coastline. And it doesn't really account for storms and the seasonal waves that we we experience year in and year out in the Hawaiian Islands, and what that means for seasonal waves inundating inland. And so basically, in addition to modeling passive flooding, we modeled coastal erosion, how sea level rise will change the shape of our shoreline or make our shoreline erode inland. We also modeled the effect of annual high wave flooding, meaning that when you get a higher level of sea level, the waves that come into the Hawaiian Islands, and we know exactly how serious those waves can be, essentially there's less friction on the reef. They ride higher on the reef and are simply at a higher elevation. And so those waves are going to tend to penetrate deeper inland. And so we're going to have waves washing much further inland than we would under lower sea levels rise. And so we model all of these factors together, we separately, and then we combined them into a sea level rise exposure area, which is illustrated by the, I guess, purple layer. And that was the basis for demonstrating statewide exposure and the basis of understanding the impacts of sea level rise along the shoreline. And I can get into that in a little more detail in just a second here. Oh, and this is just an example of the passive flooding problem. It's a diagram which basically shows what happens if you just simply raise sea level rise, let's say by 3 feet. And as you can see illustrated in the diagram, you're going to have marine inundation from higher waves. You're going to have erosion, but the water is going, the sea level is actually going to push up the water interface, the freshwater interface. And so now we're going to have freshwater flooding inland areas. You're going to have streams and channels that are going to back up because sea levels are higher, which is going to push flooding into inland layers. We're going to have drains backing up, which is going to push more water into inland areas. And so these backshore areas that are, 100, 200, 300, 400 feet away from the shoreline are going to become increasingly flooded from this passive flooding issue that we face. So here's an example of what passive flooding might look like in Waikiki at 3.2 feet of sea level. This could happen, the science right now tells us that we're pretty much expecting 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. But it's physically possible that we could get 3.2 feet of sea level rise earlier than that. So maybe around 2060, 2070, 2080, we could actually experience some pretty significant sea level rise effects in the Hawaiian Islands. Of course, after that is anybody's guess because, the thing is really changing all the time. And it really depends on the extent to which humanity gets control of its greenhouse gas emissions. We don't seem to be doing too well on that front right now. That has to change. So basically you can see where the flooding is occurring. Look at the Aloi Canal, because what's going to happen is that the water is going to back up in the canal and it's going to simply spill over the banks of the canal and flood low-lying areas. And you see water circulating in areas where they don't seem to be connected to other surface water sources. That's probably groundwater coming up or ground saturation. In any case, the situation doesn't look too exciting for Waikiki under a scenario of 3.2 feet of sea level. So in order to understand, okay, I need to get going on this. In order to understand the impacts of sea level rise on our economy, we did do some economic analysis. And so for the state, we calculated that about 28,000 acres would be flooded at 3.2 feet of sea level rise, 6,500 structures flooded, almost 20,000 people displaced, and 119 miles of roads impacted or flooded by sea level rise. And what I'm saying is this could happen, probably going to happen sooner than later in my own personal opinion. And then we have numbers for Oahu. I won't go through that, but you can see Oahu is actually the most heavily impacted island of all the Hawaiian Islands, partly because we have such a large population and so much infrastructure, but actually geographically and geologically speaking, it's just for some reason a lot more vulnerable than the other islands, unlike the Big Island, which has sort of a lot less vulnerability because of its geology. So once again, more numbers. The thing that the SLREXA and the sea level report does not capture is the total cost of sea level rise to our society, because we didn't actually calculate the economic impact of sea level rise on public infrastructure, nor any sort of multiplier effects that sea level rise will have on the broader economy. And so now we're talking about, you know, not just $20 billion, we're talking about, you know, possibly hundreds of billions. We're talking about ordinal scale of much larger sums of money. And these are just sort of examples of rain and high tide flooding. Flooding at West Maui, East Honolulu, some of the erosion they're experiencing up on that side of the island. So what are we going to do? We're gonna think about how we can sort of move ourselves away from the shoreline. It's called managed retreat. This is a study done by the Office of Planning, Coastal Zone Management Office, assessing the feasibility of managed retreat. We can continue to armor our shorelines. We can continue to raise structures to escape flooding, but at the end of the day, we're going to have to move away from these areas that are going to be flooded. And I'm going to race through some of these, so I want to give Matt an opportunity to give his presentation. So identifying impacts and managed retreat from the SLREXA zone, identifying areas subject to SLREXA, recognize an island-wide vulnerability zone, formulate a comprehensive adaptation strategy, new plans to develop outside of the SLREXA. We need to develop our urban areas with more intelligence than we've done in the past, so we incorporate green solutions into new urban development, energy efficiency, transportation efficiency, resiliency, flood proofing, using less land. We have to think about all of these tools to make ourselves smarter. And so I'll get into some of these now. So we need to basically continue to do education and outreach for climate change adaptation. And one of the things we're working on currently is we're trying to get a mandatory real estate disclosure law passed so that people who purchase land around areas that are being impacted by sea level rise understand the risks that they're investing in. We need to engage communities across the state, because we need to know from the communities that are being impacted by sea level rise, we need to know what challenges they faced from their perspective, and really sure what their preferences are in terms of dealing with it. It's their community, it's their land, it's their property, it's their children. And so we definitely need to hear from them and understanding, making sure they understand what the risks are, but then we'd like to know from them what the solutions are from their perspective. We need to really up the media coverage on this issue. That's an obvious. Here's some more just comments about what we need to be doing to promote managed retreat. And obviously one of the first things we need to think about is incorporating SLREXA into county community plans. So you got to get into the planning framework early, incorporate your hazard discussions so that as the communities are planned and the actual zoning frameworks roll out, they're incorporating hazard vulnerability into these new plans and zoning features. We got to look at the special management areas in terms of improving language in those areas so that we can account for sea level rise vulnerability and support managed retreat actions. And of course, public infrastructure is a major concern. Our highways are highly vulnerable, and we have to really think about a long-term plan to retreat those roads into areas that, you know, at least can be safe from experiencing erosion effects or flooding effects for a number of decades. But that's very complicated because there's a lot of communities that you have to work through on those types of changes. And then we, you know, accommodation of adaptation, accommodation of adaptations, simply doing things to make buildings more resilient to flooding and that type of thing.
Great, thank you, Sam. And thank you, Cam, for the introduction. For those that might have missed it, my name is Matthew Gonser, and I'm with the City and County of Honolulu's Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency, and I hope I can offer some additional context and information, especially on Sam's final point on keeping this active and in people's eyes. The ideas presented in the report are one thing, but there are specific processes that exist in state and county law that we need to ensure that we are utilizing to the fullest to really intentionally and proactively integrate this information in all of our community planning moving forward. And I'm going to provide some additional context just about the office and where the city is in incorporating the wealth of information coming from the state, as well as from our own city's Climate Change Commission, so that you all see how there are opportunities for you as residents and community members to get involved in the process. But it's important, particularly here on Oahu, that residents know that there actually is a process by which we are supposed to manage environmental and community change through time. And what you can see on the left there is a general flow of how state law informs and influences and directs city and county planning. And ultimately, what I want to encourage people to understand is that we have this community planning process, of which you can see the map on the right-hand side of these 8 community plan areas that are really intended and set up to be where we define our values and our goals and how we turn those into action through some of the infrastructure functional planning, how we plan and permit things, and how government considers investments, right? The how and the where and the what of what we put public dollars to. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. And just to make a plug, the primary urban center, which you see there in orange about Kahala through Pearl City, is about to wrap up its most recent update process. And the North Shore Community Plan is about to launch in early next year. So I encourage you to, if you are a resident in those areas or just someone that's interested, to follow along with the Department of Planning and Permitting as they embark on these activities. Similarly, the Department of Environmental Services, which is solid waste and wastewater, in their facilities planning, and in particular, an example here from the Wai'anae's sewer facility, sewer shed, they're looking at their pipes, pumps, and plants to better understand what are the current risks and what are the future risks at different levels of sea level rise, even up to 6 feet, so that they can better engage in some of the community planning and the intergovernmental planning that needs to happen to think about how and where communities need to be served for things like wastewater management. And then down to the level of how we need to react to the legacy of decision-making in the past that was really planned and designed for an environment that does not exist anymore today, and the real grave consequences for both public trust resources as well as people's investments. And one of our main forms of equity oftentimes includes houses. And the North Shore, as demonstrated here, is not the only place on Oahu that's grappling with some of these concerns. But there's a real challenge brewing as property owners are getting a bit reactionary to try to literally shore up what potentially is little left of their remaining property to protect their home or protect their investment. But in addition to literal things falling into the ocean, there are other public health concerns around the on-site sewage disposal systems that might be compromised as a result of this condition. So even though we know we need to rectify our shoreline regulations and rules, just changing the rules won't necessarily get to the answer of how we actually implement managed retreat. But we know that the North Shore Community Plan really needs to take a strong stance on what it thinks it wants for the future of this 7-mile miracle, which we know as the North Shore beaches, because we could irreparably damage and lose these beaches as early as mid-century, as was just articulated by a UH Coastal Geology report that came out. But moving back out into how do we take very tactical, specific action, I wanted to highlight and bring to everyone's attention that just this month, our office, growing out of the Resilience Strategy, action number 28, launched Climate Ready Oahu, which is to look at climate adaptation island-wide to accelerate some of these conversations, both at the community plan level, as well as the departmental infrastructure and functional planning level. And I would encourage all of you to go to Climate Ready Oahu and participate in the first phase survey, as well as get informed about some upcoming meetings that are happening to address these early questions of what are the consequences of climate change. Because as I said before, it's a false question to ask, do you believe in climate change? That's irrelevant because it's been measured and it's projected, and we know that we've already seen the consequences of it here. So how do we better understand it towards mid-century and the end of the century to ensure that we're taking the proactive and responsible actions to limit risk into the future? And we've worked hard to ensure that as much of this information is readily accessible for community members, government employees, as well as business and industry sectors, where we've taken both the state sea level rise report information, as well as a whole variety of other climate impact layers, and brought them into one place called the Climate Ready Oahu Web Explorer, so that people can come to better understand what it means for different people in different places, and how is this information extremely relevant for these community planning discussions. And as both Kem and Sam mentioned, right, it's not just the sea level rise concerns. We additionally, through volunteers, collected temperature and humidity data on what just happened to be the hottest day of the year on Oahu last year, and used that information to build out an Oahu community heat assessment, because we know that temperature is the #1 global killer in terms of hazard impacts. And though it's, for the most part, generally comfortable here on Oahu, our environment is changing. So we need to ensure that we're taking measures to address the heat and temperature today, whether it's eliminating or reducing paved surfaces or getting more vegetation, both street trees and other green infrastructure practices, so that not only do we continue to have beautiful places that we can love into the future, but that they're actually comfortable enough for us to be outside and to enjoy this island home and all of the social networks that we rely upon. And then moving on, we also know that we have a history of legacy of inequity on this island, and the history of this place is both sad and tragic. So how do we not just acknowledge it, but really take that information and better leverage community strength and community cohesion to inform these practices? Because just as Sam said, even though the state DOT is aware that the roadway is falling into the ocean in Ka'ava, they have also asked a very appropriate question of, if the data says that other places, both Mauka and Makai of this highway, will be inundated as a result of sea level rise, is the correct answer that the highway needs to be here? What is the community vision for how to provide access and transportation for a changed environment? And these are conversations that are difficult but need to be had at the community planning level. And not just equity, but how do we actually align our budget discussions? And this was something that we explored in the resilience strategy process of looking at best examples for screening tools or questions to pose agencies or pose administrations on thinking through, again, how and where we invest our precious public dollars, and what are the opportunities to either leverage state and federal monies or look at other city and community partnerships. And it's because we are seeing the consequences of past decision and inaction that we need to really take a beat and think about what we do or do not do in the coming decade and the consequences for people into the future. We have opportunities, and those opportunities present expectations for either landowners, developers, realtors, or community members. But when we then permit certain things or don't allow or invest in other things, we take on certain obligations, and we need to be honest and upfront about the risks that we face today and the risks that might result as that might come as a result of any of those particular decisions. And what you can see here is just a collage of high tide images that impact whether it's the basement parking lot at Ala Moana, Waikiki, places like Mapunapuna, the North Shore, cultural sites like He'ia Fish Pond, or even storm drainage infrastructure in Waikiki near the Hilton. And it's because climate costs us, right? I mentioned at the very beginning that we export a sizable amount of money from this community to import the thing that is causing us to have to adapt and prepare for these changes. And it's already impacted recreation and community facilities, private residences, and our public trust beaches, as well as discussions around TOD and the concept of redevelopment in some communities like Mapunapuna. Sam mentioned the data that exists in the state sea level rise report, and this is really just what's at risk if we don't take any action, both in land and property value. The state Department of Transportation has looked at some of the real pressing issues for their statewide coastal highway program, and they assessed some of the most immediate needs on the order of about $15 billion for either hardening in place, elevating, or relocating stretches of the highway. And with the city, we've also seen concerns with both our wastewater facilities on the left and some of the challenges that the Board of Water Supply has had in addressing the transmission or water main breaks in the coastal lowlands, where they have to wait for low tide before they can even get into the subsurface to address the leak.
Thanks.
Yeah, at the state level, we have a really wonderful website, the Hawaii Climate Portal, and you can. It's just got so many really great resources in it. It's all customized. We do have climate commission meetings virtually now. I think there's a meeting scheduled for this month. I would suggest that you go onto the Hawaii Climate Portal website and look for a date for that meeting and see how you can get access to the media event. But yeah, it's politicians. We're still, you know, it's in many ways it's sort of an extension of that age-old problem about getting politicians to understand environmental issues. You know, if we want to take it there, and how they're constantly how would you say, battling with how to address multiple needs, social needs, education, health, infrastructure, roads. That's where all the money goes.